My name is Elena Vance. To my mother, Beatrice, I was always the plain daughter, the one who lacked the ambition to climb the social ladder and the beauty to marry into it. She spent years trying to orchestrate my life, pushing me towards suitable men, greedy lawyers, and arrogant middle managers, while constantly mocking my quiet boyfriend, Leo. She saw Leo as a nobody, a simple tech freelancer with a messy car and a kind smile. She didn't know that Leo didn't need to climb the corporate ladder because he built it. She didn't know that my unremarkable partner was the reclusive CEO of the global conglomerate that owned the very company where she worked as a senior director. Now she's organized a merger wedding of her own design, trying to tie me to a man I despise. But Leo is coming to the ceremony, and when he arrives, he isn't coming as a guest. He's coming as the man who owns the room, the company, and my heart. The scent of Chanel No. 5 and desperation always followed my mother. Beatrice Vance lived her life in a perpetual state of keeping up with the Joneses, except in her world the Joneses were billionaires, and we were merely millionaires on the verge of social extinction. To her, I was a flawed asset, a beautiful girl who refused to play the game of strategic matrimony. I sat in the sprawling sunroom of our family estate, trying to read a book while my mother paced back and forth, clutching a leather-bound wedding planner as if it were a holy relic. "Elena, you're not listening," she snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Julian Thorne is coming for dinner tonight. His father owns half the shipping ports in the Atlantic. This isn't just a date, it's a strategic alliance. Do you have any idea how hard I've worked to secure this introduction?" "I'm not interested in Julian, Mom," I said without looking up. "He's a narcissist who talks about his yacht in the third person. Besides, I told you I'm seeing Leo." My mother let out a sound that was half laugh, half strangled sob. "Leo, the software consultant? Elena, the man drives a 10-year-old Subaru and wears hoodies to dinner. He's a nobody. He's a technician. In 10 years, he'll still be fixing people's printers while Julian is running a global empire. You are a Vance. You deserve a man with a title, a man with a legacy, not someone who thinks a big night out is ordering pizza and watching documentaries." She didn't know that Leo's 10-year-old Subaru was a deliberate choice for anonymity, and that his hoodies were made of custom-spun vicuña wool. She didn't know that Leo didn't fix printers. He designed the artificial intelligence that governed the global logistics network Julian's father relied on. "Leo is kind, he's brilliant, and he makes me happy," I said firmly. "That's more than Julian can say." "Happiness is for people who can't afford a penthouse in Manhattan," Beatrice scoffed. "You are being selfish. My company, Omni Global Solutions, is currently undergoing a massive restructuring. The board is looking for any reason to trim the senior staff. If I can announce that my daughter is marrying into the Thorne family, my position is untouchable. You are literally holding my career in my hands, and you're throwing it away for a man who probably has a favorite brand of ramen." The irony was delicious. Omni Global Solutions was a Tier 3 subsidiary of Aether Industries. Leo was the founder and majority shareholder of Aether. Technically, Leo was my mother's boss's boss's boss. "I'm not marrying Julian, Mother. End of discussion." "We'll see about that," she whispered, her eyes narrowing. "I've already sent out the invitations for the engagement gala next month. Everyone who matters will be there, even the regional VP of Omni Global. I will not be embarrassed by you. You will wear the dress I bought, you will stand next to Julian, and you will act like the woman I raised you to be." I felt a cold shiver of anger. This was her final move. She was going to force me a public engagement, banking on the fact that I wouldn't cause a scene in front of her corporate peers. She thought she could bully me into a life of gilded misery. That night, I called Leo. "She's doing it again," I said, leaning against the balcony. "The Thorn Gala. She's trying to trap me into a public announcement. She called you a printer fixer today, by the way." Leo's low, melodic laugh came through the phone. It was a sound that usually calmed me, but tonight it had a sharp, mischievous edge. A printer fixer? That's a new one. I thought I was a glorified librarian last week. "Leo, this is serious. She's inviting her bosses. She's using me to secure her job." "I know, Elena. I've seen the internal memos about the restructuring at Omni Global. Beatrice is aggressive. But maybe it's time we stop playing the quiet freelancer game. If she wants a gala with the power players, let's give her one. Let her invite everyone. Let her build the highest pedestal she can find." "What are you planning?" I asked, a smile finally tugging at my lips. "I think it's time for a site visit. The CEO of Aether Industries hasn't checked on his subsidiaries in a while, and I think I'd like to bring my fiancé as my guest of honor. Don't fight her on the gala, Elena. Let her plan the most expensive night of her life. I'll handle the guest list." For the next month, I played the part. I let Beatrice drag me to fittings. I let her parade me in front of the Thorn family. I watched as she spent thousands on flowers, a string quartet, and a cake that cost more than a mid-sized sedan. She was radiant, her ego inflating with every yes from a high society guest. She was so busy curating the perfect marriage that she never noticed the subtle changes in the corporate air. She didn't notice when the regional VP of Omni Global suddenly became frantic. She didn't notice when the guest list for her family event was suddenly augmented by a dozen security details from a firm she didn't recognize. "Tonight is the night, Elena," Beatrice beamed as she walked into my room on the evening of the gala. I was wearing the midnight blue gown Leo had sent me, not the one she had picked. "You look acceptable, though that dress is a bit modern, don't you think? No matter. Julian is waiting. The VP is here. Even the board members are buzzing. There's a rumor that a high-level principal from Aether Industries might show up. Can you imagine? If I impress them tonight, I could be the next executive director." "I hope you get exactly what you deserve tonight, Mother," I said, looking at my reflection. I wasn't the plain daughter anymore. I was the storm. We walked down the grand staircase of the Pierre Hotel. The ballroom was a sea of silk and diamonds. Julian Thorn was standing at the center, looking smug in a tuxedo that was a size too tight. My mother was flitting around like a queen, introducing me to the future Mrs. Julian Thorn. Then the heavy oak doors at the back of the room opened. The music didn't stop, but the air in the room suddenly changed. It was that specific silence that only follows true power. A man walked in, flanked by 4 men in dark suits with earpieces. He wasn't wearing a hoodie, he was wearing a charcoal gray suit that screamed sovereignty. My mother froze. Her jaw literally dropped as she recognized the man from the internal Wall of Fame, the reclusive founder of Aether. "Is that—" she stammered, clutching my arm so hard it bruised. "It is him. It's Mr. Sterling, the CEO." I smiled, stepping away from her. "Actually, Mom, his name is Leo, and he's late for our dance."
My dear ones, thank you for listening to this story. It makes me incredibly happy to feel that you are here with me. I try my best for you and post new videos every day, putting a piece of myself into them. If my stories resonate with you, your subscription and viewing of other videos will be the warmest support for me and inspiration to continue telling stories.
The ballroom of the Pierre Hotel, which minutes ago felt like my mother's personal stage, suddenly felt like a courtroom. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and cold, hard reality. My mother's hand was still clamped onto my arm, but her grip had gone from controlling to desperate. She wasn't looking at me. She was staring at the man walking toward us, the man she had called a printer fixer and a nobody for 3 years. The silence was so absolute that I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning and the frantic beating of my mother's heart. Leo didn't walk like the software consultant Beatrice thought she knew. He moved with a relaxed, predatory grace, his eyes fixed solely on me, ignoring the gasps and the frantic whispering of the elite crowd. The regional VP of Omni Global Solutions, a man named Mr. Henderson, who usually walked as if he owned the world, was suddenly bowing his head, his face a mask of sweating anxiety. "Mr. Sterling?" Henderson stammered, stepping forward and nearly tripping over a floral arrangement. We didn't expect a visit from the principal tonight. Welcome. I had no idea you were interested in the Thorne-Vance alliance." Leo stopped a few feet from us. He didn't look at Henderson. He didn't even acknowledge the Thorne family, who stood frozen like statues. He looked directly at Beatrice, whose face had gone from a triumphant pink to a sickly, ghostly white. "The Thorne-Vance alliance?" Leo's voice was smooth, carrying the effortless weight of a man who makes decisions that move markets. "I'm not interested in an alliance, Mr. Henderson. I'm here for my fiancé." My mother's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. She looked at Leo, then at me, then back at Leo. The cognitive dissonance was almost visible. Her mind was trying to reconcile the ramen-eating freelancer with the god of Aether Industries. "Fiancé?" Beatrice finally managed to choke out, her voice an octave higher than usual. "But, Leo, you are Leopold Sterling? The owner of Aether?" "Hello, Beatrice," Leo said, his eyes cold and unimpressed. "I believe the last time we spoke, you were explaining to me that I would never be distinguished enough to even hold Elena's coat. You were quite concerned about my career prospects. I hope my current position meets your high standards." Julian Thorne, sensing his $50 million social merger evaporating, tried to interject. "Wait, there's some mistake. Elena is supposed to announce our engagement tonight. This gala was paid for by the Vance and Thorne families. You can't just... Who do you think you are?" Leo finally turned his gaze to Julian. It was like a spotlight hitting a moth. "I'm the man who holds the lease on your father's primary shipping terminal in Singapore, Julian. And as for who I am, I'm the man Elena chose when I had nothing but a messy car and a hoodie. What do you have, other than your father's credit card and a very loud suit?" Julian went silent. The Thorne parents, usually the loudest people in the room, began to back away, literally distancing themselves from the impending explosion. They were sharks, and they knew when a bigger predator had entered the water. Beatrice was trembling now. She looked around at her colleagues, her bosses, and her rivals. All of them were watching her with a mixture of pity and schadenfreude. She had spent a month bragging about her daughter's upgrade, and now she was standing in front of the ultimate power player, realizing she had been insulting him for years. "Elena, darling," my mother hissed, trying to force a smile that looked more like a grimace. "Why didn't you tell me? Why play this game? We could have planned something so much more appropriate for Mr. Sterling. We could have..." "It wasn't a game, Mother," I said, stepping forward and taking Leo's hand. His grip was warm and solid, a stark contrast to the cold, calculating world my mother had raised me in. "Leo wanted to see who you really were when you thought he had nothing to offer you, and you showed him. You showed him every single time you mocked him at dinner. You showed him when you tried to sell me to the Thornes to save your job. I was doing it for you," she cried, her voice cracking. "I wanted you to have a secure life." "No," Leo interrupted, leaning in. "You wanted a secure title. You wanted the Vance name to be untouchable. But here's the reality, Beatrice. Omni Global is undergoing restructuring, and as of this morning, I've signed the final order. The senior director positions are being eliminated. Performance-based reviews only. The ballroom gasped. Beatrice looked like she was about to faint. You're firing me? On my daughter's engagement night? I'm not firing you because of Elena, Leo said, leaning in. I'm letting you go because a woman who can't recognize the value of a person without a bank statement is a liability to my company's culture. You spent years looking for a big boss to impress, Beatrice. You just didn't realize he was sitting in your kitchen eating your inferior appetizers. I looked at my mother. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to please her. I didn't feel the weight of her expectations. I felt free. I looked at the dress she had hated, the midnight blue silk that shimmered under the chandeliers, and I felt like myself. Mother, the gala you planned is beautiful. Thank you for the flowers and the quartet, but Julian won't be needing the ring. I turned to the crowd, to the VPs and the socialites who had spent the night judging me. The engagement is still happening, I announced, my voice clear and unwavering. But I won't be the future Mrs. Thorne. I am, and always have been, the partner of Leopold Sterling, and we would like the music to resume. Leo signaled to his security detail, and suddenly Julian Thorne was being escorted towards the exit, followed by his bewildered parents. The regional VP, Henderson, practically sprinted to the orchestra to tell them to play Leo's favorite piece. My mother stood in the center of the ballroom, a lone island of ruined ambition. She had reached for the stars and realized she had been stepping on the sun the whole time. "Shall we?" Leo asked, offering me his arm. "I thought you'd never ask, boss," I whispered. As we stepped onto the dance floor, the room erupted in applause, half of it out of genuine awe, the other half out of a desperate need to stay on Leo's good side. But I didn't care. I looked at the man I loved, the man who had hidden his empire just to make sure I loved the person, not the crown. My name is Elena Vance. I was the plain daughter, the disappointment, and the failure. But tonight, I'm the bride of the man who owns it all. And the best part? The look on my mother's face as she realizes she's officially unemployed and I'm officially her superior. The merger was complete, but it wasn't the one she wanted. It was the one I deserved.
The sun rose over the city with a clarity that felt almost insulting to those who had lost everything in the shadows of the previous night. For my mother, the Pierre Hotel Gala was supposed to be the dawn of her new era as a corporate deity. Instead, it was the site of her public execution. I woke up in Leo's penthouse, a place of glass, light, and a silence that didn't feel heavy but liberating. But I knew the peace wouldn't last. A woman like Beatrice Vance doesn't go down without a final, desperate attempt to rewrite the ending. I was sitting at the marble kitchen island, sipping coffee and looking out at the skyline when Leo walked in. He was back in his freelancer uniform, a simple black t-shirt and gray sweatpants. The king of Aether had vanished, replaced by the man who used to argue with me about which sci-fi movie to watch on Friday nights. "You look deep in thought," he said, pressing a kiss to the top of my head. "Regretting the firestorm we started?" "Not for a second," I said, leaning back into him. "But I know my mother. She's probably spent the last 6 hours drafting a 1,000-word apology that's actually a veiled request for her job back. She doesn't know how to exist without a title." "Then she's going to have a very difficult morning," Leo replied, his voice dropping to that calm executive tone. "The severance package I authorized is generous, but the non-compete clause is absolute. She won't be working in the tech or logistics sector for a long time. I wanted to make sure she has time to rediscover herself without a business card." Just then, my phone began to vibrate on the counter. The caller ID simply read, "Mother." I looked at Leo. He shrugged. "It's your call, Elena, but remember, you don't owe her a seat at our table anymore." I picked up. "Hello, Mother." "Elena, darling!" Her voice was frantic, lacking its usual polished cadence. I could hear the clink of a glass in the background, likely a very early mimosa.
What a night! Truly, what a night! I've been up all night thinking we really should have a private brunch, just the three of us. You, me, and Leopold. We have so much to plan. The real wedding, the press release, my new role at the headquarters. Mother, stop, I said, my voice as cold as the marble beneath my hands. There is no new role. Leo was serious. You were terminated for cause. Your behavior toward the CEO of your parent company was unprofessional and discriminatory. You're lucky he's giving you a severance at all. But I'm his mother-in-law, she shrieked, the desperation finally breaking through. He can't fire his own family. Think of the optics, Elena. If people find out the CEO of Aether fired his wife's mother, the stock will take a hit. It's bad for business. I'm trying to protect him. You're trying to protect yourself, I countered, and Leo doesn't care about the optics of doing the right thing. He's spent 3 years watching you treat people like pawns. You didn't just insult a nobody, Mom. You insulted the man I love. You tried to force me into a marriage with a man who disgusted me. Did you think a morning after brunch would fix that? I was doing what was best for the Vance name, she cried. You don't understand the pressure, Elena. You've always been so soft. You don't know what it takes to survive in this world. I survived you, I said quietly, and that was the hardest job I ever had. I hung up. The room went silent again. I felt a weight lift off my chest, a weight I had been carrying since I was a little girl trying to earn a gold star from a woman who only valued diamonds. Leo walked over and took the phone from my hand, placing it face down. She's at the front gate, by the way. My security team just alerted me. She's demanding to be let up. She brought a family heirloom, some antique watch she says belongs to you. I don't have any heirlooms, Leo. She probably bought it at an auction this morning to use as a bribe to get past the lobby. I sighed. What do we do? We don't do anything, Leo said, a mischievous glint in his eyes. But I think it's time she met the real management team of Aether Industries, the ones who handle the unpleasant tasks. We watched the security feed on the wall monitor. Beatrice was standing in the lobby of the Sterling Tower, arguing with a mountain of a man in a black suit. She was waving a small velvet box and pointing at the elevator. She looked small. For the first time, she didn't look like a social architect. She looked like a fan trying to get backstage at a concert she wasn't invited to. Tell them to give her the standard exit interview, Leo said into his intercom. The exit interview? I asked. What's that? It's a tradition at Aether. When someone tries to use a personal connection to bypass corporate ethics, they get a meeting with the head of compliance. In this case, that's Sarah. And Sarah doesn't like people who bully her friends. On the screen, the security guard stepped aside. A woman in a sharp gray suit walked out. This was Sarah, Leo's childhood friend and the most feared woman in the company. She didn't bow to Beatrice. She didn't offer a hand. She simply opened a folder. We couldn't hear the words, but we saw the effect. Sarah pointed to several lines in the document, likely the records of Beatrice's corporate expense irregularities that Leo had quietly ignored until now. My mother's face went from indignant to terrified. She realized that Leo hadn't just fired her. He had the evidence to ensure she never worked in a high-level position again. She's leaving, I observed, as Beatrice turned and walked, almost ran out of the lobby, leaving the velvet box on the security desk. She needed to know that power isn't a weapon you use on your children, Leo said, turning off the monitor. Now, enough about her. We have a real wedding to plan, and I have a very specific condition for the ceremony. What's that? I asked, smiling. No ballroom, no Pierre Hotel, no corporate VPs, just a small garden, a few real friends, and I'm wearing a hoodie under my suit jacket. I wouldn't have it any other way, I laughed. I looked at the man who had built a kingdom but preferred to live in my heart. My mother had spent her life looking for the great boss, never realizing that the greatest power of all is the ability to walk away from the game.
My name is Elena Vance. I was the bride of the great boss, but more importantly, I was finally the architect of my own life. The merger was over, the restructuring was complete, and for the first time, the Vance name meant exactly what it was supposed to: love without a price tag.
A wedding should be a sanctuary, a quiet oath taken between two souls. But when you are marrying the man who holds the keys to a global empire, the world refuses to leave you alone. Leo and I had chosen a secluded botanical garden in upstate New York, a place of glass greenhouses and ancient ferns, far from the cold marble of Manhattan. I wanted to breathe. I wanted to forget the merger my mother had tried to force. But as I stood in the dressing room, the scent of jasmine in the air, a shadow fell across the sunlit floor. Julian Thorne hadn't learned his lesson. Some men don't understand that when a shark meets a leviathan, the only option is to swim away. I was adjusting the simple lace of my veil when the door creaked open. I expected my bridesmaids or the coordinator. Instead, I saw Julian Thorne. He looked disheveled, his expensive tuxedo wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot with a mixture of alcohol and pure, unadulterated spite. He wasn't the polished heir I had seen at the gala. He was a man witnessing the total collapse of his future. "You really think he loves you, Elena?" Julian spat, leaning against the doorframe. "You're just a trophy, a way for a tech nerd to prove he can take something from a man like me. Do you have any idea what your dear Leo did to my family this week? He didn't just take the terminal lease. He called in every debt, every favor. My father is being investigated by the SEC because of your husband-to-be." "Leo didn't do anything your father didn't deserve, Julian," I said, my voice steady. "He simply stopped looking the other way. Now get out before I call security. This is a private ceremony." "Security?" Julian laughed, a jagged, ugly sound. "I didn't come here to talk. I came to show you who you're really marrying. I have a file here, Elena, proof that Aether Industries began as a shell company for money laundering. If I release this today, Leo goes to prison and your fairy tale becomes a federal case, unless, of course, you walk out of here with me, right now." I looked at the folder he was waving. It was a classic Thorne move, blackmail born of desperation. He didn't realize that in Leo's world, information wasn't a weapon, it was a currency that Leo had already devalued. Before I could respond, the door opened wider. Leo was standing there. He wasn't in a hoodie today. He was in a bespoke black suit, looking every bit the sovereign Julian pretended to be. He didn't look angry, he looked bored. "Julian," Leo said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to calm the very air in the room. "I was wondering if you'd show up. I actually placed a bet with my head of security. I gave you a 70% probability of a desperate last-minute intervention." "Stay back, Sterling," Julian shouted, clutching the folder to his chest. "I'll ruin you. I'll post this to every news outlet in the country." "The laundering files?" Leo asked, walking slowly into the room. "The ones involving the Caymans and the 2018 infrastructure bonds?" "Julian, I wrote those files. I planted them in your father's server 6 months ago, as a honeypot. If you release them, you're not exposing me. You're exposing the digital signature of Thorne Maritime. You'd be confessing to your own family's crimes." Julian's face went from red to a translucent, sickly gray. He looked down at the folder as if it had turned into a serpent. You set us up? I gave you enough rope to hang yourselves, and you turned it into a noose. Now you have a choice. You can leave this garden and spend the next few years trying to salvage what's left of your father's reputation, or you can stay and I'll have you arrested for trespassing and attempted extortion before the first song starts. What's it gonna be? Julian Thorne, the man my mother thought was the ultimate prize, turned and fled. He didn't just leave the room, he ran towards the parking lot, his dignity trailing behind him like a tattered shroud.
Leo turned to me, his expression softening instantly. I'm sorry, Elena. I wanted this day to be perfect. I didn't think he'd be stupid enough to actually come here. He was just a ghost, Leo. I reached out to straighten his tie. A ghost from a life I don't live anymore. Are we ready? More than ready, he whispered. The ceremony was a blur of sunlight and green leaves. There were no corporate logos, no photographers from Vogue, no VPs trying to climb the ladder. It was just us. When the officiant asked if anyone had any objections, I half expected my mother to burst through the bushes, but the silence was absolute. Beatrice Vance was gone, silenced by the weight of her own greed. As we exchanged rings, simple platinum bands with no oversized diamonds, I felt a profound sense of closure. I wasn't the plain daughter being sold, I was a woman choosing her equal. At the small reception afterwards, Sarah, Leo's head of compliance, raised a glass. To the only woman in the world who could make Leopold Sterling turn off his phone for an entire weekend, and to the only boss I've ever had who was smart enough to marry his superior. The small crowd laughed, and for the first time in years, the laughter felt real. It wasn't the polite, calculated tittering of a Manhattan gala, it was the sound of friendship. But the final gift of the day came later that evening. Leo handed me a small tablet. One last thing for the bride, a wedding present. I looked at the screen. It was a live feed of a local community center in a modest neighborhood. There, in a brightly lit room, was my mother. She wasn't wearing Chanel. She was wearing a volunteer vest, awkwardly handing out pamphlets at a job fair. "What is this?" I asked, confused. "It's part of her settlement," Leo explained. "She has to complete 500 hours of community service, specifically helping underqualified candidates find entry-level jobs. I thought it would be good for her to see the nobodies she used to mock. If she completes it, she gets to keep her apartment. If not, well, she'll have to find out what it's really like to start from the bottom." I watched my mother on the screen. She looked frustrated, out of place, and utterly humbled. For the first time, she was serving others instead of herself. "It's perfect, Leo," I said, closing the tablet. I looked at my husband, the great boss, the printer fixer, the man who had seen my value when I couldn't see it myself. The merger was finally complete. The Vance name was gone, replaced by Sterling, but the woman remained, stronger, wiser, and finally truly loved. "Shall we go home, Mr. Sterling?" I asked. "Wherever you are, Elena, that's home," he replied.
Power is often mistaken for a throne, but in reality, it is a scalpel. After the honeymoon, the world expected me to settle into a life of high-fashion lunches and charity galas, the silent consort to the king of Aether. They didn't realize that I hadn't spent 3 years with Leo just to watch him work. I had spent them learning how his empire breathed. My mother's legacy at Omni Global wasn't just a personal failure. It was a systemic infection of cronyism and fear. I didn't want a crown. I wanted the archives. I wanted to finish what Leo started and ensure that no woman like my mother could ever use a corporate title to destroy a life again. My first day at the Aether Industries headquarters didn't start with a ribbon cutting. I arrived at 7 a.m. wearing a charcoal power suit that felt like armor. I didn't go to the penthouse office. I went to the 14th floor, the Human Resources and Compliance Hub. This was the engine room where my mother's management style had been replicated by hundreds of mid-level directors who thought that cruelty was a synonym for efficiency. "Mrs. Sterling," the floor manager stammered, his face turning a shade of pale that matched the white marble floors. We weren't expecting you. Mr. Sterling's office is on the 80th floor." "I know where my husband is, Mr. Davies," I said, my voice echoing with a newfound authority. "But today I'm not here as his wife. I'm here as the newly appointed chairperson of the Ethics and Cultural Oversight Committee. I believe you have the Beatrice Vance files. I'd like to see the internal complaints that were suppressed over the last 5 years."
Davies hesitated. His eyes darted toward the glass-walled offices where several senior directors were already watching us with suspicion. These were the men and women my mother had mentored, the Vance protégés. They thrived on the same culture of fear and social climbing that had almost ruined my life. "Those files are sensitive, ma'am," Davies whispered. "A lot of people currently in high positions were involved in those restructurings. Opening them could cause a massive internal rift." "Then let it rift," I said, walking past him into the central conference room. "I'm not here to smooth things over. I'm here to audit the cost of your silence. Bring me the files, or I'll have Sarah from compliance come down here and do it for me. And we both know she doesn't use the gentle touch." For the next 6 hours, I buried myself in the data. It was worse than I thought. My mother hadn't just fired people, she had blacklisted them. She had used Aether's massive influence to ensure that anyone who challenged her authority was rendered unemployable in the entire tri-state area. It was a scorched earth policy disguised as corporate optimization. One name kept appearing: Project Phoenix. It was a secret initiative my mother had spearheaded to automate the entire logistics branch, which would have resulted in the immediate termination of over 5,000 employees, mostly single parents and veterans, just to boost the quarterly margins for her own bonus. I felt a tap on the glass. It was Leo. He stood there with 2 cups of coffee, a small, proud smile on his face. He walked in and set a cup in front of me. "You've been in here for 6 hours. The Vance protégés are currently having a collective panic attack in the cafeteria. There are rumors you're drafting a execution list." "It's not an execution list, Leo," I said, rubbing my temples. "It's a restoration list. I found 42 people who were terminated under false pretenses because they refused to participate in my mother's kickback schemes. I want them reinstated, today, with back pay and public apologies." Leo leaned against the table, his expression turning serious. "That's a bold move, Elena. The board will fight it. They don't like admitting they were wrong, especially when it costs money." "Then tell them it's a cost of doing business with me. You're the big boss, Leo, but I'm the one who knows how these people feel. I was the plain daughter they could ignore. I know what it's like to be a ghost in your own life. We're not just a tech company anymore. We're going to be a human one." The Vance protégés didn't go down without a fight. By 3 p.m., a delegation of senior directors, led by a man named Harrison, a man who had been my mother's right hand, marched into the conference room. He looked at me with the same condescending pity my mother used to use. "Mrs. Sterling, with all due respect, you're overstepping, Harrison," said, tossing a folder on the table. "You've been a member of this family for 5 minutes. You don't understand the complexities of Project Phoenix. This automation is necessary for our global competitiveness. You can't let feelings dictate the bottom line of a trillion-dollar company." "Harrison," I said, standing up and leaning over the table, "I've been a member of the Vance household for 25 years. I understand exactly how you operate. You don't care about global competitiveness. You care about the 15% bonus you were promised if you hit the termination targets. Well, here's the new bottom line. Project Phoenix is canceled. The funds will be redirected into a retraining program for the staff." "You can't do that," Harrison shouted. "Leo wouldn't allow such a reckless waste of capital." "Leo didn't do it," a voice boomed from the doorway. Leo walked in, his presence immediately sucking the air out of Harrison's bravado. He stood behind me, his hand resting firmly on the back of my chair. "I gave Elena full autonomy over the ethics committee. Her word is final. And Harrison, I've been looking at your expense reports. It seems you've been using the company jet for scouting missions that look remarkably like golf trips in the Bahamas. You're not in a position to talk about reckless waste." The blood drained from Harrison's face. In that moment, the Vance era at Aether Industries officially died. The cronies realized that the plain daughter they had planned to manipulate was actually the one who held the keys to their exit interviews. By the end of the day, the first 10 Phoenix victims were called. I made the calls myself. Hearing the disbelief and then the tears of joy on the other end of the line was worth more than any gala, any diamond, and any social title. As Leo and I left the building that evening, the sun was setting behind the skyscrapers. I felt exhausted, but for the first time, I felt like I had earned my place in the world. "You did good today, chairwoman," Leo whispered as we waited for the car. "I just did the math, Leo," I said, leaning my head on his shoulder. "One mother's greed equals 5,000 families' misery. I just balanced the equation." I looked at my phone, a text from my mother's community service supervisor. Beatrice Vance completed her first week. She spent 4 hours helping a janitor write a resume. She cried twice. Progress is slow, but she stayed. I smiled and tucked the phone away. The great boss might have been the man I married, but I was the one who was finally taking charge. The victory in the boardroom is often short-lived, a temporary high before the next crisis emerges from the shadows. I had successfully dismantled my mother's Phoenix project and purged her loyalists, but as I sat in the quiet of the archives, I realized there was a gaping hole in the company's history. My mother's rise to power at Omni Global hadn't just been a product of her ambition, it was funded by a ghost. For 20 years, I believed my father, Arthur Vance, had simply walked out on us, leaving a trail of debt and disappointment. But as I dug into the Class A voting shares, I found a block of 15% that was held in a blind trust, a trust that had just been activated for the first time in 2 decades. The atmosphere in the penthouse office was thick with tension. Leo was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his brow furrowed as he stared at a legal notification on his tablet. This wasn't a standard corporate dispute. This was a move against the very foundation of Aether Industries. "Elena, you need to see this," Leo said, his voice unusually grim. "That blind trust, it wasn't just a passive holding. It carries a founder's veto clause for any major structural changes to Omni Global. Someone is trying to block your reinstatement of the terminated employees, and they're doing it using your father's signature." "That's impossible," I whispered, walking over to him. "My mother told me he died in a boating accident in the Mediterranean 15 years ago. She even showed me the death certificate." "She showed you a forgery, Elena," Leo said, handing me the tablet. "Arthur Vance is very much alive, and according to this filing, he's currently sitting in a private lounge at the Pierre Hotel waiting for a meeting with the new management." My heart hammered against my ribs. The man who had been a fading memory, a scent of old books and peppermint, was suddenly a legal threat to the peace I had finally built. I didn't wait for a limousine. I took a plain cab to the Pierre, the same place where I had dismantled my mother's dreams only weeks prior. I found him in the library lounge. He didn't look like a corporate raider. He looked like an older, more tired version of myself. He was wearing a tweed jacket, sipping tea, and reading a physical newspaper. "Arthur?" I asked, my voice trembling. The man looked up, and for a moment the world stopped. His eyes, my eyes, filled with a sudden, overwhelming moisture. "Elena, you've grown into a formidable woman. I saw your speech on the internal feed. Your mother would have hated every word of it." "Where have you been for 20 years?" I demanded, refusing to sit down. Mom told me you were a failure. She told me you left us with nothing. And now you show up to block the only good thing I've done for this company. Are you just like her?" Arthur sighed, folding his newspaper with a slow, deliberate precision. "I didn't leave you with nothing, Elena. I left you with the controlling interest of Omni Global. But Beatrice, she made a deal with me. She threatened to use her connections to have me imprisoned on false embezzlement charges unless I signed over the management rights and disappeared. I stayed away to keep you safe from the scandal she was willing to manufacture. I thought if I stayed a ghost, she would at least let you live your life." "She didn't let me live," I spat. "She tried to sell me, and she used your shares to build her throne." "I know," Arthur said, his voice cracking, "and that's why I'm here. I didn't trigger the veto to stop you, Elena. I triggered it to protect the shares from being liquidated by the Thorne family's remaining allies. I've been watching from the shadows, waiting for the moment Beatrice lost her grip. I wanted to make sure that when I handed these shares to you, there was no one left to steal them." He pushed a leather portfolio across the table. Inside were the original share certificates, the 15% that gave the holder absolute power over the Omni Global subsidiary. "I don't want the money, Elena. I've lived a quiet life as a librarian in Vermont. I want you to have the weapon you need to finish the job. If you hold these, Leo doesn't even need to use his CEO authority. You will be the majority owner of your own destiny." I looked at the papers. This was the heirloom my mother had tried to bribe her way into the building with. She must have known Arthur was back. She must have been terrified that the truth would come out, that her self-made success was built on a foundation of blackmail and a stolen legacy. "Why now?" I asked. "Because you married Leopold Sterling. I knew his father. He was a man of integrity. I knew that with Leo by your side, you wouldn't be bullied anymore. I saw you stand up to her at that gala, and I knew the plain daughter had finally found her crown." I felt a wave of complex emotion, anger at the lost years, but a strange budding relief. I wasn't the daughter of a failure and a tyrant. I was the daughter of a man who had sacrificed his life to keep a monster at bay. I took the portfolio. "Come with me, Arthur. Leo needs to meet you, and there's someone else who needs to see you." "Your mother?" Arthur asked, a flicker of fear in his eyes. "No," I said, a cold smile touching my lips. "The volunteer coordinator at the community center. I think it's time Beatrice Vance sees exactly what happens when the nobodies she trampled on come back to collect the debt." We drove to the center. I didn't call ahead. We walked into the crowded, dusty room where my mother was currently filing paperwork for a local food bank. She looked exhausted, her hair uncharacteristically messy, her designer blouse stained with coffee. When she saw me, she started to put on her Beatrice mask. "Elena, have you come to your senses? Have you brought Leo to discuss my reinstatement? This charity work is beneath us, surely you—" Then she saw the man standing behind me. The mask didn't just slip, it shattered. Beatrice Vance let out a sound that wasn't human, a strangled, high-pitched gasp as she clutched the edge of the plastic table. "Arthur?" she whispered, her eyes wide with a terror I had never seen before. "You're supposed to be in Europe. We had an agreement." "The agreement ended the moment you tried to sell our daughter to a Thorne," Arthur said, his voice echoing through the humble community center. "I gave you 20 years of silence, Beatrice. I gave you my company, but you couldn't stay away from her life. You tried to break the one thing I actually cared about." I stepped forward, holding the share certificates. "The blind trust is dissolved, Mother. The veto is mine. I'm not just the boss's bride anymore. I'm the woman who owns the chair you used to sit in, and unlike you, I don't need blackmail to keep it." My mother sank into a folding chair surrounded by the very people she had spent her life avoiding. She looked at Arthur, then at me, then at the dirty floor. She had nothing left, no shares, no job, and now no secrets. I walked out of the center with my father by my side. Leo was waiting at the car, a look of profound respect on his face as he shook Arthur's hand. "The restructuring is complete, Leo," I said, looking up at the man I loved. "The last ghost is out of the closet. Then let's go home, Elena. We have a real company to run, and a family dinner to catch up on." The plain daughter was gone. The boss's bride was a title, but the owner was my reality. The harvest of truth was finally gathered, and the Vance name, the real Vance name, was finally clean.
With my father, Arthur, by my side, and the controlling shares of Omni Global firmly in my hands, I felt as though the final piece of the puzzle had clicked into place. But in the world of high-stakes finance, a moment of peace is often just the eye of the storm. My mother's downfall had created a vacuum, and while I was busy turning the company into a force for good, the ghosts of the Thorne family were gathering in the shadows. Marcus Thorne, a man who viewed his son Julian's humiliation as a stain on his dynasty, wasn't going to let us walk into the sunset. He didn't want a merger anymore, he wanted a massacre. The transformation of Omni Global began in the very boardroom where my mother once ruled with an iron fist. We renamed it the Sterling Vance Foundation. It was no longer a machine for extraction, it was a sanctuary for innovation. We launched a massive venture capital fund specifically for underqualified brilliance, people like the Leo I first met, who had the genius but lacked the pedigree. "It's beautiful, Elena," Arthur said, looking at the new mission statement engraved in the lobby. "You've turned her temple of greed into a library of opportunity." But as we stood there, my phone began to chime with a frantic, rhythmic urgency. It was the Aether Bloomberg terminal alert. "Leo, look at the ticker," I said, my heart dropping. Aether, IND, AETHR, minus 12%, minus 18%. A massive coordinated short sell was hitting our parent company. Someone was dumping millions of shares into the market, spreading rumors of an imminent federal investigation into our unstable new leadership. We raced to the Aether war room. Leo was already there, his sleeves rolled up, surrounded by a dozen of the world's best quantitative analysts. The screens were a sea of red. "It's Marcus Thorne," Leo said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "He's liquidated his entire shipping empire just to fund this attack. He's betting everything that he can crash our stock price, trigger the bank's margin calls, and force a hostile takeover before the market closes." "He's committing financial suicide just to hurt us?" I asked, stunned by the sheer irrationality of the move. "He's not just trying to hurt us, Elena," Arthur interjected, looking at the flow of trades. "He's trying to reclaim the Vance shares. If Aether's price hits the floor limit, the blind trust's backup clauses your mother secretly signed with him years ago, the Thorne Group can seize the Omni Global assets as collateral." My mother's last betrayal. Even in her absence, her past deals were like landmines buried in our garden. She had used my father's shares as a secret guarantee for a Thorne loan she never intended to pay back. "How long do we have?" I asked. "The floor limit is $142 a share," Leo replied, pointing to the descending line. "We're at $155. At this rate, 90 minutes. Marcus is using high-frequency trading bots to overwhelm the system. We need a massive capital injection to stabilize the price, but our liquid reserves are tied up in the Foundation's new grants." I looked at Arthur. He looked back at me, a silent understanding passing between us. "The Vermont accounts," he whispered. "What Vermont accounts?" I asked. "When I left, I didn't just take a library card, Elena. I took the original patent royalties for the Aether navigation algorithms. I've been letting them sit in a compound interest fund for 20 years. I was saving it for your wedding day, but I think a rescue fund is a much better gift." Arthur began to type. On the screens, a new buyer emerged. An unknown private entity began to buy every single share Marcus Thorne was dumping. The price began to jitter, the descent slowing. "It's not enough," Leo muttered. "Thorne is pulling in his allies from the London markets. He's got the offshore banks on his side. We need something more than just money. We need a kill shot." I looked at the data. Marcus Thorne was over-leveraged. To fund this attack, he had used his shipping fleet as collateral. He was essentially borrowing ships he didn't own yet to buy stock he wanted to destroy. "Leo, what if we don't fight him on the stock? What if we fight him on the ships?" Leo looked at me, a spark of pride igniting in his eyes. "Go on." I said, "The Thorne Maritime is currently 48 hours late on their environmental compliance payments for the Singapore terminal, the one you reclaimed," I said, my fingers flying across the database. "If we trigger a default event on the terminal lease right now, his shipping contracts become void. The banks will pull his credit in the middle of the trading session." "It's a nuclear option," Sarah from compliance warned. "It will disrupt global shipping for days, but it would bankrupt the Thorne family within the hour." "They tried to take my life, my marriage, and my company," I said. "Authorize the default." Leo nodded. "Do it." We watched the screen. The moment the default was logged in the Singapore exchange, the Thorne Group's credit rating plummeted from A+ to junk status in seconds. In the Aether War Room, we saw the reaction. The massive sell orders from Marcus Thorne suddenly stopped. He couldn't sell anymore because he no longer had the collateral to cover the trades. The market realized the Thorne Group was insolvent. Suddenly, the short squeeze began. Everyone who had followed Thorne into the short was now scrambling to buy back Aether shares at any price to avoid being wiped out. Aether end +5%, +15%, +30%. The stock price didn't just recover, it skyrocketed. Marcus Thorne hadn't just failed, he had accidentally made us the most profitable company in the world in the single afternoon. 2 hours later, the dust settled. The Thorne Group was in receivership. Marcus and Julian were officially ruined. But the victory felt different this time. It wasn't just a defensive win, it was the final cleaning of the slate. I walked out onto the balcony of the Aether Tower, the cool evening air hitting my face. Leo joined me, handing me a glass of water. "It's over, Elena," he said. "The Thornes are gone. Your mother's secret deals are voided. The Sterling Vance Foundation is now the largest shareholder in the parent company. You literally own the building now." "I never wanted to own a building, Leo," I said, leaning my head on his shoulder. "I just wanted to own my own name." "You own more than that," a voice said behind us. Arthur walked out, looking younger than he had this morning. "You own the future, and I think it's time we showed your mother the final results of her strategic alliance." I looked at my phone. One last message from the community center supervisor. Beatrice Vance saw the news on the lobby TV. She sat in silence for an hour. Then she asked for more work. She's currently helping an immigrant family translate their housing application. She didn't mention the stock once. I smiled. Maybe, just maybe, the plain daughter had finally taught the great director the most important lesson of all, that the only investment that never fails is humanity.
Time is the only currency that cannot be manipulated by a market trade or a corporate merger. 3 years have passed since the night the Thorne dynasty collapsed and the Sterling Vance Foundation rose from its ashes. In the world of high finance, 3 years is an eternity, long enough for empires to be forgotten and for new legends to take root. But for me, these years weren't measured in quarterly earnings or stock buybacks. They were measured in the quiet growth of a garden, the steady rhythm of a life built on truth, and the slow, painful thawing of a mother's frozen heart. The Sterling estate on the outskirts of the city was a far cry from the cold, intimidating mansions of my childhood. It was a place of light, warmth, and open doors. I stood on the back terrace, looking out over the sprawling lawn where a small group of children from the Aether employee daycare were playing. In my arms, I held a 6-month-old bundle of curiosity, our son, Arthur Leo Sturman. He didn't have a strategic alliance waiting for him, and he didn't have a corporate ladder to climb. He had a family.
"He has your eyes, Elena," a voice said behind me. I turned to see my father, Arthur. He looked healthier than he had in decades, his face tanned from hours spent in the estate's library and gardens. He had become the unofficial archivist for the Sterling Vance Foundation, ensuring that every project we funded was documented, not for profit, but for posterity. "And his father's stubbornness," I laughed, adjusting the baby's blanket. "Leo spent 40 minutes this morning trying to explain the basics of cloud computing to a 6-month-old. "Well, the boy needs to know who he's dealing with," Leo said, stepping out onto the terrace. He looked relaxed, his dark hair slightly windswept. He had stepped back from the day-to-day operations of Aether, handing the reins to a board of directors that I had handpicked for their integrity. He was no longer the big boss to the world. He was just Leo to us. "Is today the day?" Leo asked, his expression turning slightly more serious as he looked at the calendar on his watch. "Yes," I nodded. "The 500 hours are over. Her probation ended this morning." Beatrice Vance was no longer a name that commanded a room. Over the last 3 years, she had lived in a small 2-bedroom apartment in a middle-class neighborhood, a home paid for by the foundation, but one she had to maintain herself. She had worked at the community center, the food bank, and finally as a literacy tutor for adults. She hadn't sent a single manipulative email. She hadn't made a single call to her old contacts. She had simply worked. We drove to the community center in a modest car, no security detail, no tinted windows. I wanted to meet her as a person, not as a superior. When we arrived, I saw her through the glass doors of the classroom. She was sitting at a small table with an elderly man, patiently helping him trace the letters of his own name. She looked older, her face lined with the reality of a life lived without a glamour team, but there was a softness in her eyes that I had never seen before. When the class ended, she walked out into the hallway and froze. She saw Leo, then Arthur, and finally me and the baby in my arms. "Elena," she whispered. She didn't reach for her pearls. She didn't check her reflection. She simply stood there, her hands trembling slightly. "The supervisor says your service is complete, Beatrice," Arthur said, stepping forward. "You've fulfilled every requirement. You're a free woman." "I haven't been free for a long time, Arthur," she said, her voice raspy. She looked at me, her eyes filling with tears. "Elena, I spent 20 years trying to make you into a version of me. I thought if I could make you perfect, I could forget how imperfect I was. I was wrong. I was so incredibly wrong." I walked toward her, holding the baby out. "Mother, this is Arthur, your grandson." Beatrice's breath hitched. She reached out, then pulled back, as if afraid she might break him with her touch. "Can I—" "He's not a corporate asset, Mom," I said gently. "He's just a baby. He doesn't care about your resume." She took him into her arms, and the great Beatrice Vance finally collapsed. She sat on a wooden bench in that humble hallway and wept, not for the loss of her career or her status, but for the years she had wasted looking for power in all the wrong places. "I don't want the job back," she said later, as we sat in the center's small cafeteria. "I don't want the title. I'd like to keep working here. The literacy program, they need a coordinator, someone who knows how to be aggressive for the right reasons. I think I can do more good here than I ever did at Aether." I looked at Leo. He gave me a subtle nod. "The Sterling Vance Foundation is looking for a director of community education. It's a modest salary, no company jet, no corner office, but you'd be reporting directly to me." Beatrice smiled, a real bittersweet smile. "Reporting to my plain daughter, I think that's the most poetic justice I could ever hope for. I accept." As we left the center, the 4 of us, Arthur, Beatrice, Leo, and I, walked out into the afternoon sun. The paparazzi were nowhere to be found. The Thorne family was a footnote in a legal textbook. The boss's bride was a story the tabloids had stopped telling. We were just a family, a complicated, bruised, but healing family. That evening, back at the estate, I stood by the window and watched the stars. Leo came up behind me, wrapping his arms around me. "We did it, didn't we?" I whispered. "We broke the cycle." "You did it, Elena," Leo replied. "I just provided the capital. You provided the heart.
You're the real CEO of this family. And the printer fixer, I teased, turning in his arms. He's retired, Leo laughed. He's strictly into toddler maintenance now. I looked at the reflection in the glass. I wasn't the girl who was afraid of her mother's shadow anymore. I was a woman who had built a world out of silence and silicon, a woman who had turned a nobody into a husband and a tyrant into a grandmother. My name is Elena Vance Sterling. I was the plain daughter, the failure, and the bride. But tonight, I am simply the woman who knows that the greatest boss in the world is the one who leads with love. The merger was final, the audit was clean, and the legacy was finally, truly our own.